Panzer III
The
commander
Matilda
squinted
is
through his
unstoppable.
Kepulus sights,
We need air
watching
support
the squat
immediately.
British tank lumber into range. 21st of May, 1940, northern France. His crew had already knocked out a dozen French Hotchkiss tanks that morning. This would be another easy kill. He gave the order. The 37mm gun barked, and the armor-piercing round streaked across the wheat field. Then something happened that would haunt German tank crews for the next 2 years. The shell hit the British tank square on the hull and ricocheted skyward with a shower of sparks. The Matilda didn't even slow down. Fire again. The loader slammed another round into the breech. Same result. The shells simply bounced off. By now, the British tank had closed to $400 armour, and its 2-pounder gun was tracking their position. The German commander's voice cracked as he screamed into the radio. "We cannot penetrate. We cannot penetrate." Across the battlefield at Arras, this scene repeated itself dozens of times. Wehrmacht crews who'd spent 3 weeks crushing French and British forces suddenly found themselves face to face with a tank their weapons couldn't touch. The panic was immediate and visceral. German after-action reports from that day use words like, quote, impenetrable and invulnerable. Some crews abandoned their tanks and fled on foot rather than face the Matildas. Others fired every round they carried, watching in horror as shell after shell ricocheted harmlessly into the sky. One Panzer III fired 17 rounds at a single Matilda from decreasing range. Not one penetrated. The British tank destroyed it at leisure, then moved on to its next victim. What made this so terrifying wasn't just the armor. It was the complete reversal of expectations. German Panzer crews had become accustomed to dominance. Their tactics, their training, their entire doctrine assumed they could engage and destroy any enemy tank they encountered. The Matilda shattered that assumption. Here was a tank that ignored their guns, methodically working its way through their formations whilst they could do nothing but retreat or die. The technical reality was brutally simple. The Matilda II's frontal armor measured 78mm thick, nearly 3 times thicker than the Panzer III's protection. The German standard anti-tank gun, the 37mm Pak 36, could barely scratch it even at point-blank range. The 50mm Pak 38, just entering service, could penetrate only under perfect conditions at very close range. Even the Panzer IV's short-barreled 75mm gun, firing high-explosive rounds, simply wasn't designed for this level of armor penetration. German crews tried everything. They aimed for tracks, for vision ports, for any weak point they could imagine. Some attempted ramming attacks. Others called in Stuka dive bombers. But close air support couldn't always arrive in time. And attacking well-camouflaged tanks with bombs proved frustratingly difficult. Infantry support was useless. The Matilda's armor shrugged off anti-tank rifle fire as easily as machine gun bullets. By nightfall on the 21st of May, the psychological damage was done. Radio intercepts captured German voices edged with genuine fear. Intelligence reports filtering back to Berlin spoke of a new British, quote, heavy tank against which normal weapons were ineffective. The myth of Panzer invincibility had met reality, and reality wore 78mm of hardened steel. This wasn't supposed to happen. Germany's armored forces had conquered Poland in weeks and were on the verge of defeating France. Now a handful of British tanks, accounts vary, but fewer than 100 Matildas participated in the entire French campaign had triggered genuine panic among Wehrmacht tankers. The question racing through every German tactical headquarters became urgent. How do you stop something your weapons cannot kill? The Matilda's terrifying effectiveness wasn't an accident. It was the deliberate result of a uniquely British approach to armored warfare. Whilst other nations designed tanks as fast, maneuverable cavalry replacements, Britain created 2 entirely separate tank categories with opposing philosophies. The Matilda belonged to the infantry tank concept, and understanding this philosophy explains both its legendary protection and its eventual limitations. The idea crystallized in the mid-1930s under General Hugh Ells and military theorist Percy Hobart. Their logic was straightforward. Infantry attacks failed because soldiers couldn't survive machine gun fire crossing no man's land. Give them a mobile pillbox that could crawl forward with them, absorb all small arms fire, destroy enemy bunkers, and the infantry would break through. Speed was irrelevant. Soldiers walk at perhaps 5 kilometers per hour. The tank needed only to match that pace whilst being absolutely invulnerable to everything an enemy might shoot at it. This thinking produced the Matilda's predecessor, the Matilda I in 1936. That original design took the concept to extremes. 65mm of frontal armor, a crew of just 2 men, and armed only with a single machine gun. It weighed 11 tons and could barely manage 13 kilometers per hour. More importantly, it cost only $6,000 per unit, cheap enough to build in quantity. The War Office loved it. Here was a tank that could support infantry attacks without breaking the budget. But the Matilda I had obvious flaws. One machine gun couldn't destroy enemy tanks or fortifications. The 2-man crew was overwhelmed, so Vickers Armstrong began designing its replacement in 1936, working to specification A-12. The Matilda II, officially designated infantry tank M2, emerged from these requirements. The designers faced a clear mandate: maximum armor, infantry support armament, mechanical reliability, and cost-effectiveness. Speed wasn't even on the list. The result was a tank that looked like a moving fortress. The whole was cast in a single piece, revolutionary for the time, providing 78mm of frontal protection without weak points from joined plates. The turret added another 78mm. For comparison, Germany's Panzer IV carried only 30mm frontally. France's Char B-1 BIS, considered heavily armored, had 60mm. The Matilda was quite simply the most heavily protected tank in the world when it entered service in 1939. This armor came with trade-offs that would later prove fatal. Twin AEC diesel engines generated only 190 horsepower to move 27 tons of tank. Maximum speed on roads reached just 24 kilometers per hour, and cross-country performance dropped to half that. The suspension was adapted from Vickers's commercial designs, reliable but unsophisticated. The turret ring was small, limiting what gun could fit inside. The 2P-pounder anti-tank gun chosen was excellent in 1939, but would become obsolete rapidly. Meanwhile, Britain developed cruiser tanks for the cavalry role. Faster, lighter machines like the Crusader that could exploit breakthroughs and conduct reconnaissance. The two-tank doctrine seemed logical. Cruisers would race around flanks whilst infantry tanks ground through fortifications. Each type optimized for its specific role rather than trying to do everything adequately. The Matilda's designers never imagined their tank-fighting Panzer divisions in open maneuver warfare. They envisioned it supporting infantry assaults against prepared German defenses along a static Western front, much like the Great War. In that role, the Matilda's slow speed wouldn't matter. Trenches don't run away. Its heavy armor would be essential. Its small gun would suffice for bunkers and machine gun nests. History had other plans. When war came in September 1939, it looked nothing like the static warfare Britain expected. The Matilda would face exactly the mobile tank versus tank combat its designers never intended. That combat arrived on the 21st of May, 1940, outside the French town of Arras. By then, the German blitzkrieg had shattered Allied lines. Panzer columns were racing toward the Channel coast, threatening to encircle the entire British expeditionary force. The situation looked hopeless. The British and French armies were in full retreat, their command structure collapsing. But someone decided to punch back. Major General Harold Franklin assembled what he could. 2 infantry battalions, and 74 tanks from the 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments. Of those tanks, only 58 were Matildas. The rest were lightly armored Mark I's. 16 were the heavily armored Matilda II's. Just 16 tanks would create a legend that afternoon. The plan was simple. Drive south from Arras, cut the German supply lines, and disrupt their advance. Nobody expected miracles. They hoped merely to slow the Wehrmacht juggernaut for a day or two, buying time for evacuation. The attack stepped off at 2 in the afternoon. Almost immediately, everything went wrong with the larger plan. Infantry couldn't keep up with the tanks. Artillery support failed to materialize. Air cover never arrived. The French attack on the right flank collapsed before it started. By conventional military logic, the British should have withdrawn. Instead, the Matildas pushed forward into the village of Dans, straight into RML's 7th Panzer Division. What happened next shocked everyone, including the British. The Matildas rolled through German positions like a harvester through wheat. Anti-tank guns fired desperately. Shells bounced off. Panzer III's and IV's engaged at close range. Their rounds ricocheted harmlessly. One Matilda took 14 direct hits without penetration. Another survived 17. The German guns simply couldn't hurt them. Meanwhile, the Matilda's 2-pounder guns, while small, were perfectly adequate for the thin armor of German tanks and vehicles. They methodically destroyed everything they encountered. RML's division began to disintegrate. Infantry fled their positions. Tank crews abandoned vehicles and ran. The 7th Panzer's War Diary records heavy enemy tank attack and notes a critical situation. That's military understatement for panic. RML himself grabbed a battery of field artillery and personally directed fire against the Matildas. The shells couldn't penetrate either. German casualties mounted horrifically. Over 400 men killed or wounded. Dozens of vehicles destroyed, including 9 Panzer IVs. Some reports claimed the British knocked out nearly 200 German vehicles that afternoon, though exact figures remain disputed. More importantly, the attack created psychological chaos far beyond its tactical scope. German High Command lost contact with RML for several hours. Reports flooding back to headquarters spoke of massive British tank formations, hundreds of tanks, possibly an entire armored corps. In reality, those 16 Matilda II's and their lighter companions had created an impression of overwhelming force through sheer invulnerability. German intelligence officers, accustomed to their own tanks being knocked out by single hits, couldn't comprehend tanks that survived dozens of direct strikes. Some historians argue this brief panic influenced Hitler's controversial halt order, issued 3 days later, stopping German tanks short of Dunkirk. The reasoning, if British tanks this powerful were operating behind German lines, perhaps the Panzer divisions were overextended and vulnerable. Whether the Matildas directly caused that decision remains debated, but they certainly contributed to German caution at a critical moment. Had the Wehrmacht pushed through to Dunkirk immediately, the entire BEF might have been captured. Yet the Matildas couldn't sustain their attack. Mechanical breakdowns took their toll. The tanks had been overworked for days. German reinforcements arrived with heavier guns. Fuel and ammunition ran low. By nightfall, the surviving Matildas withdrew. Most were lost over the following days, abandoned during the retreat to Dunkirk. The strategic situation remained hopeless, but the legend was born. The Matilda's next act played out beneath the scorching North African sun, where it would achieve dominance even more complete than at Arras. By late 1940, Italy had declared war and invaded Egypt from Libya, with an army of over 200,000 men. Britain's Western Desert Force could muster barely 36,000 troops. The numbers looked grim until someone counted the tanks. Amongst Britain's meager forces were 50 Matilda II's of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment. Against them, Italy fielded hundreds of tanks. It wouldn't matter. Italian armor in North Africa consisted mainly of the Fiat and Solaldo M11 and M13 medium tanks. On paper, they seemed adequate. 13mm of armor, 37mm or 47mm guns, reasonable speed. In practice, they were mobile coffins. Their riveted construction meant hits often sent rivets flying inside the crew compartment, like shrapnel. Their armor, thin to begin with, was made from mediocre steel that cracked under impact. Their guns used ammunition so underpowered, it struggled to penetrate even light British tanks. Facing a Matilda was like throwing eggs at a battleship. Operation Compass began on the 9th of December, 1940. General Richard O'Connor's plan was simple. Use the Matildas as an armored battering ram to smash through Italian fortified camps, whilst lighter cruiser tanks exploited the breakthrough. The first target was Neba, a fortified position held by thousands of Italian troops and tanks. The Matildas attacked at dawn, rolling through the camp like they owned it. Italian guns fired frantically. Nothing worked. The M13 tanks tried to fight back. Their shells bounced off harmlessly. Within hours, Nibwa had fallen. Over 4,000 Italians surrendered. The Matildas lost not a single tank to enemy action. The pattern repeated itself with almost ferrical consistency. At Tamar West, on the 11th of December, Matildas crushed another fortified camp. At Sidi Bani, they scattered an entire Italian corps. Italian tank crews, watching their rounds ricochet off British armor, whilst their own vehicles, brewed up under 2 pounds of fire, simply abandoned their tanks and fled. Some Italian units didn't even wait for the Matildas to arrive. Word spread through the camps that British tanks couldn't be stopped, and morale collapsed before the first shot was fired. The psychological impact mirrored what happened to the Germans at Arras. But worse, Italian crews at least knew their equipment was inferior to German Panzers, but they'd expected to match British tanks. Instead, they faced something that shrugged off every weapon in their arsenal. Italian anti-tank gunners discovered their 40mm guns needed perfect side shots at close range to even damage a Matilda. Frontal attacks were suicide. The gun crews died without scratching the British armor. By mid-December, the entire Italian invasion force was retreating in chaos. O'Connor's forces pursued relentlessly. The Matildas led the advance, crushing resistance wherever they found it. At Bardia in early January 1941, 45,000 Italian troops surrendered at Tobruk. Later that month, another 25,000 gave up. The 7th Royal Tank Regiment's Matildas seemed unstoppable. Italian soldiers began calling them tigers and spread stories that they were invulnerable to any weapon. The numbers tell the story. In 2 months of Operation Compass, Britain's tiny desert force advanced 800 km, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, and captured over 130,000 prisoners. British losses amounted to roughly 500 men killed. The Matildas themselves suffered almost no combat losses. Mechanical breakdowns in the harsh desert conditions caused more casualties than Italian guns. One Matilda was recorded taking over 100 hits without penetration during the entire campaign. For Italian tankers, it was a nightmare. They couldn't fight, couldn't run. Their slower tanks were overtaken and destroyed from behind. They couldn't hide. The desert offered no cover. Surrender became the only rational option. The Italian collapse forced Germany's hand. Hitler couldn't allow his ally to be completely driven from North Africa. So in February 1941, Irvin RML arrived in Tripoli with the first elements of the Deutsche Afrika Korps. He brought Panzer III's and IV's, experienced crews, and a serious problem. British Matildas had just demonstrated they were invulnerable to every German tank gun in theater. RML needed a solution immediately. That solution already existed. though nobody had thought to use it this way. The Flak-Dakig, the 88mm anti-aircraft gun, was designed to shoot down bombers at high altitude. It stood nearly 2 1/2 mm tall on its cruciform mount, fired a 9-kilo shell at 840 megahertz, and could reach aircraft flying at $10,000. The gun was magnificent at its intended job. Using it against ground targets seemed almost wasteful, like hunting rabbits with a howitzer, but desperation breeds innovation. The 88's development began in the late 1920s when crew secretly worked with Swedish engineers to circumvent Versailles Treaty restrictions. By the mid-30s, the Flakton had emerged as possibly the finest anti-aircraft gun in the world. Its high velocity and heavy shell were designed to destroy aircraft at extreme range. Those same characteristics made it devastating against armor. Nobody had bothered to test that until Spain. During the Spanish Civil War, Luftwaffe Condor Legion crews discovered their 88s could destroy Republican bunkers and fortifications with ease. A few enterprising gunners tried shooting at captured Soviet tanks and found the shells punched through armor like cardboard. The lesson was noted but not widely distributed. Anti-aircraft guns were far too valuable in their primary role to waste on ground targets. That attitude lasted until German tankers met Matildas. The first recorded use of 88s against British tanks in North Africa occurred in April 1941 near Hellfire Pass. German anti-tank guns had failed completely against Matildas during several skirmishes. RML, frustrated beyond measure, ordered flak batteries forward into anti-tank positions. The gun crews thought he'd lost his mind. Anti-aircraft guns were tall, conspicuous, took precious minutes to set up, and had no armor protection whatsoever. They were designed to shoot at planes kilometers away, not tanks at point-blank range. Using them in ground combat violated every tactical principle. Then the Matildas appeared. The 88s opened fire at $1,500 main. The first shell struck home, and something happened that German forces hadn't seen in a year. British tanks stopped advancing. They didn't ricochet. The rounds punched clean through the Matilda's 70mm frontal armor, through the crew compartment, and often out the rear. The tanks exploded or simply stopped dead, smoke pouring from hatches. British crews who'd felt invulnerable suddenly found themselves burning alive. The psychological tables turned instantly. The 88's penetration capability was staggering. At $1,000 mem, it could penetrate 110 millimeters of armor. At 500 mem, that increased to 140 millimeters. The Matilda's armor, impenetrable to every other German weapon, might as well have been tinfoil. Even at $2,000 m, beyond the range at which tank combat typically occurred, the 88 could kill a Matilda reliably. British tankers, who'd grown accustomed to shrugging off German fire, now faced a weapon that guaranteed death with a single hit. But the 88 wasn't perfect. It was massive, requiring a 10-man crew and a heavy towing vehicle. Setting up for action took 8 to 10 minutes, an eternity in tank combat. The high profile made it visible for kilometers across flat desert terrain. It had no shield thick enough to stop even machine gun fire, so crews were horribly exposed. Yet, even as the 88 became the Matilda's nemesis, the British tank was already dying from internal weaknesses that no amount of armor could fix. The same design philosophy that made it invulnerable also made it obsolete. By mid-1941, the Matilda's limitations were crippling British armored operations in ways enemy fire never could. The mechanical problems emerged first. Those twin AEC diesel engines, reliable in testing, proved fragile under desert conditions. Sand infiltrated everything despite extensive filtering. The engines overheated constantly in temperatures exceeding 50 degrees C. Oil seals failed. Cooling systems clogged. Gearboxes, stressed by the tank's excessive weight, broke down with alarming frequency. The 7th Royal Tank Regiment's maintenance logs from early 1941 revealed that at any given time, 30 to 40% of their Matildas were deadlined for repairs. Not battle damage, simple mechanical failure. The suspension suffered worse. Designed for European roads and fields, it couldn't handle the desert's rocks, waddies, and endless vibration. Bogie wheels cracked, springs snapped. Tracks threw themselves with depressing regularity. A Matilda might cover 50 kilometers before something broke, whilst German tanks could manage 300. During Operation Battle Axe in June 1941, more Matildas were abandoned due to breakdowns than were knocked out by enemy fire. Crews learned to carry spare parts that other tanks didn't need, but even that couldn't prevent the constant mechanical attrition. Then there was the gun. The 2-pounder had been excellent in 1939. By 1941, it was dangerously inadequate. Germany introduced the Panzer III Farang J with 50 millimeters of frontal armor that December. The 2P-pounder struggled to penetrate it beyond 500 millimeters. Worse, the gun fired only armor-piercing solid shot. No high-explosive rounds existed for it. British tank commanders couldn't suppress anti-tank guns with explosive shells, couldn't destroy fortifications effectively, couldn't even engage infantry in the open with anything except machine guns. Every other nation's tanks carried dual-purpose guns that fired both armor-piercing and high-explosive ammunition. The Matilda could only kill other tanks, and even that capability was fading. Upgrading to a larger gun was impossible. The turret ring measured only 54 in across, barely enough for the 2-pounder. Fitting a 6-pounder or 75mm gun would require redesigning the entire tank. The British tried mounting a 3-in howitzer and a few Matildas for close support, but the small turret made loading the weapon nearly impossible. The tank was locked into its original armament with no upgrade path. Speed became a tactical nightmare. 24 kilometers per hour on roads sounds acceptable until you realize Panzer IIIs could manage 40 kilometers per hour and British cruiser tanks could reach 45. In desert warfare, where space allowed maneuver, speed meant survival. Faster tanks could choose engagement ranges, flank enemy positions, and withdraw before being outflanked themselves. The Matilda could only lumber forward or retreat slowly whilst enemies danced around it. German commanders learned to simply avoid Matildas when possible, engaging more vulnerable cruiser tanks first, then surrounding the Matildas and destroying them at leisure with 88s. The infantry tank concept itself proved flawed. Modern warfare didn't happen at walking pace. Infantry road trucks or armored personnel carriers moving far faster than a Matilda could follow. Combined arms operations required tanks to keep up with motorized infantry, coordinate with mobile artillery, and exploit breakthroughs quickly. The Matilda's plotting pace made integration impossible. It became a specialist tool useful only in specific situations, fortress assaults, holding defensive positions, whilst General Erpos medium tanks handled everything else. By late 1941, British commanders were requesting anything except Matildas. The tanks nobody wanted in North Africa got shipped elsewhere. Greece received Matildas in April 1941 during the desperate and doomed British intervention against the German invasion. The mountainous Greek terrain, with its narrow roads and steep passes, should have suited the Matilda's slow pace and heavy armor. Instead, the campaign exposed new problems. Greek roads built for donkeys and farm carts couldn't support 27-ton tanks. Bridges collapsed. Mountain passes proved too narrow. Mechanical breakdowns multiplied in the rough terrain. When German forces attacked, the Matildas couldn't maneuver effectively and were often bypassed by faster German units moving through the hills. Most were destroyed or abandoned during the evacuation. The survivors limped back to Egypt, battered and nearly worn out. But the Pacific was calling. From late 1941 onwards, Britain and Australia shipped Matildas to the Far East, where Japan's lightning advance threatened India, Australia, and everything between. This decision seemed logical on paper. Japanese tanks were thinly armored and poorly gunned. The Type 95 Ho light tank, Japan's most common model, carried only 12 millimeters of armor and a 37-millimeter gun. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank wasn't much better. Against such opposition, even the Matilda's obsolete 2P pounder would be devastating, and its armor would be impenetrable. The Pacific seemed like a chance for redemption. Reality was messier. Jungle warfare didn't suit the Matilda any better than mountains had. The tank's weight made it bogged down in mud constantly. Narrow jungle tracks couldn't accommodate its width. Dense vegetation limited visibility to dozens of meters, negating the advantage of heavy armor. Japanese infantry could approach unseen and attack with magnetic mines, Molotov cocktails, or simply bypass the tanks entirely. The humidity was catastrophic for mechanical reliability. Engines designed for European conditions overheated and seized in tropical heat. Rust attacked every metal surface. Electrical systems failed constantly. Maintenance became a nightmare when spare parts had to be shipped thousands of kilometers from Britain. Australian forces used Matildas extensively in New Guinea and Bougainville from 1943 onwards. The 2nd Australian Armoured Brigade's 4th Armoured Regiment found the tanks useful in specific circumstances, attacking Japanese bunkers and fortifications where the Matilda's armor allowed it to close to point-blank range and destroy positions with impunity. Japanese anti-tank guns, designed for their own thin-kinned vehicles, couldn't scratch a Matilda. The psychological effect mirrored what happened to Italians in North Africa. Japanese infantry, armed with anti-tank rifles, watched in horror as their bullets bounced off, then died under machine gun fire. But tank versus tank combat in the Pacific was rare. Japanese armor doctrine emphasized infantry support over armored jewels, and their tanks usually operated dispersed amongst infantry, rather than in concentrated formations. When encounters did occur, Japanese tanks died quickly. The 2P pounder could penetrate their armor at any combat range. At Mill Bay in August 1942, Australian Matildas destroyed several Japanese tanks without loss. Similar one-sided engagements occurred throughout New Guinea. Yet these victories felt hollow. The Matilda was overkill for fighting Japanese tanks and poorly suited for everything else the Pacific Theater required. Burma saw the Matilda's final significant combat. The British 14th Army used them during the reconquest of Burma in 1944 and 1945. Again, they proved effective in narrow tactical situations, bunker busting, defensive strongpoints, but useless for mobile operations in monsoon conditions. By mid-1945, most were being replaced by American-supplied Shermans and British Churchills. The last Matildas in British service were retired in 1945. Australia kept some operational until 1946 before finally scrapping them. The Matilda's influence extended far beyond the battlefields where it fought. It forced Germany to revolutionize its entire anti-tank doctrine and accelerate armored development in ways that shaped the rest of the war. Before encountering Matildas, German anti-tank strategy relied on the 37mm Pak 36, a weapon troops mockingly called the Dorner because it merely announced your presence to heavily armored targets. That was acceptable when facing Polish 70p tanks or French Renault 35s. Against Matildas, it was useless. The 50mm Pak 38 entered production in 1940, partly in response to intelligence reports about British heavy tanks. Even this weapon struggled against Matilda's frontal armor, except at close range. German anti-tank units demanded something bigger immediately. The response was the 75mm Pak 40, rushed into development in late 1940 and entering service in 1941. This gun could reliably penetrate a Matilda at $1,000 MEP, respectable performance, though not matching the 88's reach. More importantly, Germany finally had a towed anti-tank gun that could handle heavy armor without requiring vulnerable anti-aircraft guns in forward positions. But the 88's success against Matildas had revealed something profound. High-velocity guns designed for anti-aircraft work were devastating tank killers. This realization drove the development of dedicated tank destroyers mounting 88mm guns. The Panzer Jagger Tiger, better known as the Ferdinand or Elephant, carried an 88 in a fixed casemate. The Nashorn mounted the improved 88mm Pak 43 on a Panzer IV chassis. Most famously, the Tiger I heavy tank, entering service in late 1942, mounted a version of the 88 as its main armament. These weren't adaptations. They were purpose-built vehicles designed around the lesson learned fighting Matildas. Overwhelming firepower trumps everything. German tank development accelerated in response as well. The Panzer III received a 50mm gun to replace its inadequate 37mm weapon. The Panzer IV, originally equipped with a short-barreled 75mm gun for infantry support, was upgraded with a long-barreled high-velocity 75mm that could engage heavy armor effectively. Armor thickness increased across German designs. The Panzerführung G, entering production in 1942, carried 80mm of frontal armor, more than the original Matilda. Germany was building tanks to fight the next Matilda, even though Britain had largely moved on from the design. Tactically, the Matilda taught German forces painful lessons about engaging heavy armor. Anti-tank guns, now deployed in depth with forward positions designed to channel enemy tanks into killing zones covered by heavier weapons. German commanders learned to use terrain, concealment, and disciplined fire control rather than engaging in vulnerable targets at maximum range. The practice of sighting in ambush positions became standard doctrine. Tank crews learned to identify enemy tank types quickly and withdraw rather than waste ammunition on targets they couldn't penetrate. These tactical adaptations learned fighting Matildas served Germany well when facing Soviet heavy tanks later. The broader arms race accelerated. Britain responded to German upging by developing the 17-pounder anti-tank gun and mounting it in Sherman Fireflies and Challengers. Germany countered with the Panther and its long-barreled 75mm gun. The cycle continued, each side building guns to defeat the other's armor, then building thicker armor to resist those guns. The Matilda had started this spiral in 1940 when it proved conventional anti-tank weapons obsolete. By 1945, tanks carried guns that could penetrate twice the Matilda's armor at twice the range whilst wearing protection. The Matilda's 2-pounder couldn't scratch. The lessons from that technological jewel remain strikingly relevant 8 decades later. Modern armored forces still grapple with the same fundamental triangle that doomed the Matilda: protection, firepower, and mobility. You can optimize for two, but the third always suffers. The Matilda chose protection and adequate firepower, sacrificing mobility. It dominated until enemies developed weapons that negated its armor advantage, at which point its lack of speed became fatal. Every tank designer since has faced this same impossible compromise. The Israeli Merkava exemplifies one modern approach designed after bitter lessons in the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when Israeli tanks suffered catastrophic losses to Egyptian anti-tank missiles. The Merkava prioritized crew survival above all else. It placed the engine at the front as additional protection, used modular armor that could be upgraded, and included a rear door for crew escape or infantry transport. The design philosophy echoes the Matilda. Keep the crew alive, even if it means accepting lower speed and greater weight. Israeli doctrine accepted that modern anti-tank weapons could eventually penetrate any armor, so the goal became surviving the first hit long enough to fight back or withdraw. But the Makava also learned from the Matilda's mistakes. It mounts a modern 120mm smooth-bore gun that can fire multiple ammunition types, armor-piercing, high-explosive, even anti-personnel canister rounds. The fire control system allows accurate shooting whilst moving. Active protection systems intercept incoming missiles before they strike. Most crucially, the Merkava maintains reasonable mobility, not racing fast, but sufficient for modern maneuver warfare. It's what the Matilda might have become if British designers had understood that heavy armor alone wasn't enough. The American Abrams represents the opposite philosophy. It emphasizes firepower and mobility over protection, relying on speed, long-range engagement capability, and superior sensors to avoid being hit rather than surviving hits. The Abrams can travel 70 kilometers per hour and kill targets at 4,000 meter before enemies get into effective range. Its composite armor provides good protection, but the design assumes avoiding enemy fire is more important than withstanding it. This approach works brilliantly in open terrain, where the Abrams can exploit its advantages, and fails catastrophically in urban combat, where enemies attack from close range with weapons specifically designed to defeat armor. Both philosophies work in specific circumstances. Neither works everywhere. That's the enduring lesson. The Matilda dominated when enemies lacked weapons to penetrate its armor, and terrain prevented them from exploiting its low speed. It failed when Germans deployed 88s and fought in open desert where mobility mattered. Modern tanks face the same contextual success and failure. American Abrams tanks dominated Iraqi armor in 1991's open desert warfare, then struggled in Baghdad's streets during the 2003 invasion. Russian tanks with superb armor and firepower proved vulnerable in Chechny's urban ruins when Chechen fighters attacked from above and behind with rocket-propelled grenades. The Matilda versus 88 duel also established the pattern of technological leapfrogging that defines modern warfare. One side develops an advantage: heavy armor, a powerful gun, advanced sensors, and temporarily dominates. The opponent responds with a countermeasure that negates that advantage. The original innovator must then develop something new. The cycle never ends. Modern reactive armor defeats shaped charge warheads, so opponents develop tandem charge warheads that defeat reactive armor. So designers create active protection systems that intercept warheads. So attackers develop missiles that overwhelm active protection through sheer numbers or top attack profiles that avoid it entirely. The arms race the Matilda started in 1940 is still running.